Villain psychology, the power of silence and manipulation. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people.
What makes a villain truly unforgettable? Is it their ruthless actions, their menacing appearance, or perhaps their ability to manipulate and control those around them without saying a word? In the world of psychology, silence and manipulation are two of the most powerful tools a villain can wield, often more effective than any weapon or grandiose plan. Villains like Darth Vader, the Joker, and even real-life figures use these tactics to exert control, create fear, and warp reality to their advantage. But what is it about silence that makes it so intimidating? Why does a well-timed pause or a complete lack of communication hold such power over others? And how do these characters manipulate those around them without resorting to brute force? Understanding these psychological tools can give us a deeper insight into how villains operate, not just in stories, but in real life. Whether you're a fan of iconic films, intrigued by human behavior, or simply curious about the darker side of the mind, exploring the psychology of villains reveals some surprising truths about power, control, and the fine line between good and evil. Stick with me, and we'll uncover how silence and manipulation shape not only the most famous fictional villains but also the world we live in. Section 1: Understanding the Psychology of Villains. When we think of villains, our minds usually race to the most notorious characters in pop culture, characters like Darth Vader, Voldemort, or the Joker. These villains aren't just memorable because of their evil deeds, they stand out because of the psychological depth and complexity that defines their actions. A villain isn't just someone who does bad things. A villain is someone whose psychology is often broken, distorted, or twisted in a way that makes their actions both fascinating and terrifying. But why do these characters act the way they do? At the heart of every great villain, we often find trauma. Many villains are shaped by experiences in their past that leave deep emotional scars. These are people who, at some point, were hurt, betrayed, or abandoned. Their emotional wounds are so deep that they lead them to view the world through a lens of mistrust, resentment, and anger. For example, Darth Vader, once Anakin Skywalker, wasn't born evil. He was a slave, torn from his mother, and eventually manipulated by fear and loss. His journey into darkness is rooted in the pain he experienced, his desperate need to control the world around him, and his willingness to do anything to prevent the ones he loved from being taken away. This combination of trauma and desperation for control is a recurring theme in many villains. What makes villains so compelling is that they are often not one-dimensional. Their actions are not just senseless evil, there's a logic to what they do, even if it's a twisted one. The psychological traits that define a villain, such as narcissism, sociopathy, and psychopathy, help us understand why they behave the way they do. A narcissistic villain, for instance, has an inflated sense of self-importance and believes that their needs and desires should come before everyone else's. Sociopaths, on the other hand, may have a complete disregard for others' feelings or rights, making them capable of using manipulation as a tool to get what they want. The psychology of villainy often fascinates us because it reflects the darker sides of human nature. We may even feel a strange connection or sympathy for these characters. Why? Because villains are often mirrors of ourselves, showing us the darker possibilities of our own behavior and desires. They expose our hidden fears, our vulnerabilities, and the part of us that might be capable of crossing moral lines when pushed to extremes. In essence, understanding villains is also about understanding the complexities of human psychology, why we're drawn to darkness, and how it can sometimes shape our choices. Section 2: silence as a weapon of control. Now, let's talk about one of the most chilling tools in a villain's arsenal: silence. You've probably noticed that many of the most iconic villains in fiction don't need to say much to make an impact. In fact, their silence often speaks louder than words ever could. Think about Darth Vader. He doesn't say much, but his presence, his silence, and the tension in the air when he enters a room are enough to send waves of fear through everyone around him. Silence, in this case, isn't just the absence of sound, it's a strategic psychological weapon. Silence has a unique ability to create power imbalances. When a villain is silent, they hold control over the situation. By withholding information, refusing to speak, or simply staying quiet, they force others into a position where they have to guess, speculate, or even panic. This uncertainty makes their victims feel exposed and vulnerable. It's a psychological tactic that plays on fear and anxiety. The longer the silence lasts, the more unstable and unsure the victim becomes. You might have experienced this in your own life when someone refuses to answer your questions or goes silent after you say something important. That silence is unsettling, and it makes us feel like we have no control. Take Hannibal Lecter, for example. He is not a villain who needs to shout or engage in long speeches. His power comes from his ability to remain calm, still, and silent in moments when others expect him to speak. His silence makes everyone around him uncomfortable, because it makes them unsure of his motives and intentions. They know he's calculating, and that's terrifying. In the absence of his words, his every move, every glance, becomes a calculated piece of manipulation. In the psychological world, silence is a tool of dominance because it creates emotional confusion. In a conversation or a tense interaction, silence forces the victim to fill the void, often leading them to make concessions or to reveal information they otherwise wouldn't. A villain who knows how to use silence can control the flow of conversation and manipulate others into believing things that aren't true, just by leaving them in a state of emotional disarray. Additionally, silence is a tool of intimidation. When a villain doesn't respond or react immediately, it creates a sense of dread, making others wonder what they're thinking or planning. Silence, in this context, doesn't just serve as a power move, it plays on the very real human fear of the unknown. The longer the silence, the greater the discomfort, and the more it heightens the tension of the situation. This is a trait used by some of the most terrifying villains in fiction, from the cold silence of Michael Myers in Halloween to the menacing stillness of Pennywise in it. By mastering the art of silence, villains can dominate their environment without ever having to raise their voice. It's a form of control that is subtle but profoundly effective, and one that plays on the vulnerability of those around them. Understanding the psychology of silence helps explain why this tactic is so effective. It turns the villain into an enigmatic figure, someone whose actions are unpredictable, whose thoughts are concealed, and whose next move is always shrouded in mystery. Section 3: The Art of Manipulation. When it comes to villains, one of the most effective tools they wield is manipulation. Manipulation isn't just about controlling someone's actions, it's about controlling their mind, their emotions, and their perception of reality. Villains who are masters of manipulation know how to make others doubt themselves, question their beliefs, and act against their own best interests. They don't rely on brute force or direct intimidation, they don't need to. Instead, they plant seeds of doubt, twist the truth, and use the weaknesses of others to bend them to their will. At its core, manipulation is about control. It's about taking advantage of human psychology, specifically, the cognitive biases, emotional triggers, and deep-seated insecurities that everyone has. One of the most common manipulation techniques is gaslighting, a term that comes from the 1944 movie Gaslight, in which a husband manipulates his wife into questioning her sanity. In the context of Villains, gaslighting is used to distort reality, making the victim feel like they're losing touch with what's true. This can make the victim rely more on the manipulator, deepening the psychological control the villain has over them. Villains like Palpatine from Star Wars are experts at this kind of manipulation. Palpatine doesn't just rule through fear, he rules through trust and dependence. He carefully plays on Anakin Skywalker's insecurities, his fear of losing loved ones, and his desire for power. By presenting himself as a friend and a mentor, Palpatine manipulates Anakin into betraying everything he once stood for. He preys on Anakin's deepest fears and desires, crafting an illusion of control and power that ultimately leads Anakin down the path to becoming Darth Vader. Palpatine's manipulation is subtle and strategic, showing how a villain can slowly erode someone's moral compass and sense of self. Another manipulation tactic that villains often use is emotional exploitation. This involves manipulating a person's feelings of guilt, love, or fear to make them act in ways they might not otherwise choose. For example, the Joker in The Dark Knight uses Batman's sense of duty and compassion to manipulate him. The Joker understands that Batman's greatest weakness isn't physical, it's emotional. By creating situations where innocent people are threatened, he forces Batman to make impossible choices, thereby using Batman's own moral code against him. The Joker doesn't need to kill Batman to win, he just needs to corrupt him psychologically. A more insidious form of manipulation is love bombing. Villains use this technique to gain control by showering someone with affection, attention, and praise, only to later manipulate or exploit them. This tactic is often seen in toxic relationships, where a manipulative partner makes the other person feel special and needed, only to later demand complete loyalty and control. The villain, having already built emotional dependency, can then easily manipulate their victim's actions, emotions, and decisions. The impact of manipulation on the victim is long-lasting. It doesn't just change the way they act in the short term, it distorts their self-image, erodes their confidence, and often leaves them questioning their own judgment. The psychological scars left by manipulation can last long after the villain has gone. This is what makes the manipulative villain so dangerous. They leave a lasting effect that continues to echo in the victim's mind, long after the story is over. Section 4. Case Studies: Villains who master silence and manipulation. To better understand how silence and manipulation work in practice, let's dive into some of the most iconic villains and examine how they use these psychological tactics to control and manipulate their worlds. Darth Vader, the silent controller. Darth Vader is a perfect example of a villain who masterfully combines silence and manipulation. As Anakin Skywalker, he was once a promising Jedi, full of hope and idealism. But as he was pulled deeper into the darker side of the Force, he became a man who spoke little but whose every action carried the weight of immense control and power. His silence is not just the absence of speech, it's a deliberate tactic to instill fear, create distance, and manipulate others into compliance. Take, for example, the way Vader controls his subordinates. When he enters a room, the air thickens with tension. He doesn't need to shout orders or engage in long speeches. His silence, combined with his imposing presence, does all the talking. His few words are enough to command absolute obedience. This is a form of psychological manipulation, as his silence forces those around him to be hyper-aware of every small movement, every slight change in his body language, because they know that his next action could be fatal. Vader also manipulates his relationships, especially with Luke Skywalker. Throughout the Star Wars saga, Vader uses manipulation to cloud Luke's judgment, offering him the power to rule the galaxy by his side. This manipulation is subtle, appealing to Luke's desires for family and revenge. Vader doesn't openly threaten him. Instead, he leverages the silence between them to create emotional confusion. The lack of communication makes it harder for Luke to understand what Vader truly wants, which heightens the tension and ultimately sways his decision-making. The Joker, chaos through manipulation. If there's one villain who uses manipulation to its fullest extent, it's the Joker. Unlike Darth Vader, the Joker doesn't use silence in the traditional sense. Instead, he uses unpredictability and chaos to manipulate those around him. The Joker's ability to manipulate is rooted in his understanding of fear, chaos, and human psychology. He doesn't have a clear goal like many villains. Instead, his aim is to manipulate others into revealing their darkest selves. In The Dark Knight, the Joker manipulates both Gotham and Batman by targeting the people they care about. He pushes people to make impossible moral choices, forcing them to question their own beliefs. By threatening the lives of innocents, he forces Batman into an emotional dilemma, one that manipulates Batman's compassion against him. The Joker doesn't just want to defeat Batman, he wants to show him that everyone has a breaking point, that even the most morally upright person can be bent by manipulation and fear. What makes the Joker even more dangerous is that his manipulation is psychological rather than physical. He doesn't need to kill or physically harm his victims, at least, not at first. Instead, he plays on their vulnerabilities, using their fears, desires, and weaknesses against them. This makes him one of the most terrifying and psychologically complex villains in modern cinema. Palpatine, the Puppet Master. Palpatine, also known as Emperor Sidious, is another villain who uses manipulation in a deeply psychological way. Unlike the Joker, Palpatine's manipulation is slow, methodical, and deliberate. He understands that to gain true power, he must manipulate people over a long period of time, working behind the scenes to ensure that his will is done. His greatest accomplishment is his manipulation of Anakin Skywalker. Palpatine plays on Anakin's fears, offering him the chance to save Padme from death, a promise that ultimately drives Anakin to the dark side. By carefully cultivating Anakin's trust and affection, Palpatine manipulates him into becoming Darth Vader. What's chilling about Palpatine's approach is how he uses love and fear, two of the most powerful human emotions, as the basis for his manipulation. Section 5. Overcoming the villainous tactics of silence and manipulation. As much as we might find villains fascinating, it's crucial to understand that the tactics of silence and manipulation they employ aren't confined to the pages of a script or the frames of a movie. These psychological strategies can seep into our everyday lives, sometimes in relationships, in workplaces, and even in larger social and political systems. Understanding these tactics is the first step in defending ourselves from falling victim to them. One of the first things to recognize is manipulation itself. It's easy to see manipulation in a villain like Palpatine, who uses charm and deceit to control those around him. But manipulation is often subtle in real life. It can be a friend, partner, or colleague using your own insecurities against you to get what they want. It can be the emotional weight of a silence, where someone withholds affection or conversation to control how you behave. Whether it's gaslighting, guilt-tripping, or love-bombing, the goal of manipulation is always the same: to make the victim feel dependent on the manipulator and to distort their perception of reality. Recognizing manipulation is vital to breaking free from it. One of the key signs that you're being manipulated is when you begin to doubt yourself. If someone constantly makes you feel like you're overreacting or that your thoughts and feelings don't matter, you might be dealing with a manipulator. Gaslighting is one of the most damaging manipulation tactics because it slowly wears down your sense of reality. If you find yourself questioning your own sanity, it might be time to take a step back and re-examine the situation. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it likely is. Another sign of manipulation is when someone tries to play on your emotions. They may guilt-trip you, make you feel responsible for their actions, or use your kindness against you. Manipulators understand that emotions can cloud judgment, so they exploit this by making you feel like you owe them something, even when it's clear they're not offering anything of real value in return. They might use silence as a tool to make you feel anxious, uncertain, or desperate for their approval. The trick here is recognizing the imbalance in the relationship and reclaiming your emotional independence. When it comes to silence, understanding its impact is just as crucial. Silence, when wielded by a manipulative person, can create a feeling of powerlessness. The silence isn't just an absence of communication, it's a strategic tactic to make you question your worth or to control the flow of the relationship. In a healthy relationship, silence is natural and sometimes necessary. But when silence is used as a weapon, it's often a sign of control. If you're in a relationship where silence is consistently used to manipulate you, you may need to set clear boundaries and demand respect. One of the most powerful ways to protect yourself from manipulation is to set boundaries. Whether it's in personal relationships or in the workplace, boundaries help you maintain your sense of self and protect your emotional well-being. Don't be afraid to speak up and assert your needs. Manipulators often count on the fact that victims will be too afraid or too polite to push back. By standing firm and vocalizing your needs, you regain control of the situation. Another key defense against these villainous tactics is self-awareness. By understanding your own emotional triggers and recognizing the signs of manipulation, you become more resistant to the subtle tactics villains, and sometimes people in your life, use. Keep a level of emotional detachment when dealing with someone who uses silence to control the conversation. Don't let their unspoken words or actions dictate how you feel about yourself. If you find yourself in a situation where manipulation is ongoing, don't hesitate to seek outside help. Whether it's therapy, counseling, or simply reaching out to trusted friends, getting a different perspective on the situation can often provide clarity. Professionals can help you understand the dynamics of emotional manipulation and guide you through techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, to break free from these toxic cycles. Lastly, remember that empathy and resilience are your strongest allies. Manipulators thrive on exploiting vulnerabilities, but you can protect yourself by developing emotional resilience, learning how to handle difficult situations without compromising your values or self-worth. Build strong, healthy relationships where respect, open communication, and honesty are the foundation. By doing so, you'll become less susceptible to the toxic influence of manipulation and silence. Conclusion: understanding and overcoming villainous tactics. In examining the psychology of villains, particularly how they use silence and manipulation, we've peeled back the layers of some of the most complex characters in fiction. Characters like Darth Vader, the Joker, and Palpatine are more than just symbols of evil. They represent the darker aspects of human nature, where trauma, insecurity, and power dynamics shape the world around them. Silence and manipulation become their tools for gaining control, bending others to their will, and maintaining dominance in situations where words alone are not enough. But understanding these tactics isn't just about recognizing the traits of fictional villains. It's about learning how power dynamics work in real life and becoming aware of the psychological games that are played, often without us realizing. We've all encountered situations where silence has been used to manipulate us, or where we've been gaslighted into doubting our own reality. It's easy to feel vulnerable and confused when faced with these tactics, but the first step toward defending ourselves is knowledge. By recognizing the signs of manipulation and the impact of silence, we can protect ourselves from falling victim to these psychological traps. Setting clear boundaries, maintaining self-awareness, and seeking help when needed are all crucial steps in reclaiming our power. Just as we can learn from the villains who use silence and manipulation, we can also use this knowledge to strengthen our emotional resilience and make healthier, more informed choices in our relationships and interactions. Ultimately, the psychology of villains teaches us valuable lessons about the human condition. It reminds us of the thin line between good and evil, and how easily we can be swayed by the tactics of those who seek to control us. By understanding these dynamics, we not only gain insight into the minds of the villains we love to watch, but also gain the tools to protect ourselves from the real-life manipulation and silence that can so easily creep into our own lives. We all have the power to recognize these tactics, set boundaries, and reclaim control over our own narratives. In the end, the real victory comes not in defeating the villains around us, but in learning how to keep our own minds and hearts free from manipulation and fear. Villains psychology, the power of silence and manipulation. The psychology of villains, silence and manipulation.